Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Making Waves. Today we will be talking about Asian diaspora, which is modern diasporas are the ethnic minority groups of migrant origins residing and acting in host countries, but maintaining strong sentimental and material links with their countries of origin in their homeland. Again, before we begin, here are our land acknowledgements and our vision statement.
Let it be acknowledged that Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampunefu Band of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations of Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. We have Suksavon here that is from Phoenix, Arizona, and it is on the traditional homelands of the Acamil Otham and the Salt River Maricopa Prima Native communities.
Here at Making Waves, we try and illuminate the experiences of Asian and Pacific Islanders at Oregon State University. Facilitating dialogue surrounding culture and diversity, we hope to dive into some of the complexities of the Asian and Pacific Islander experience. Through topics such as pop culture, social identity, multiculturalism, etc., among many of the topics we wish to cover, we hope that you can resonate with our stories as well as expose yourself to some new ideas and perspectives.
So today we have another special guest with us, Benson Ton. If you want to introduce yourself.
Hello. Like I said, my name is Benson. I go by he, him, his pronouns. My major is electrical and computer engineering with a minor in computer science. And at the APCC, I work as a student success peer facilitator.
So, what is diaspora? Diaspora is a group of people who live outside the area in which they had lived for a long time or in which their ancestors lived. We'll be highlighting the cultural differences as the prevailing paradigm for thinking about minoritized identities. So for our first question, what are all our identified ethnicities? What's our generation and family's experience of living in the Asian diaspora?
So I'm Filipino, full Filipino, and I think I'm first generation. Yeah, first generation. My parents were the first to immigrate to Hawaii here in the U.S. So yeah, I am first generation, and I think just thinking of that whole concept though, personally, I think I'm a diaspora within a diaspora, moving, having my parents move to Hawaii from the Philippines, and then even then again, me coming from Hawaii to here on in the mainland, it's like living in culture within culture of like yeah, just two different diasporas, so it was definitely like a big culture shock for me there. And so in terms of when my parents and my family moved to Hawaii, I would say that the diaspora wasn't that much of a change, I'd say, because a lot of the culture and I guess community in Hawaii is pretty much similar to like the how it is in the Philippines, because the way the culture was made in Hawaii is based off a lot of like the Filipino culture and the people that priorly moved to Hawaii, and so it wasn't that too bad. So I think that I had the grace to like grow up with a lot of like the things that both my parents got to experience in the Philippines growing up, and um, still retained a lot of that culture. Hmm.
I can go next. And I think, um, which is also kind of interesting too, because so I am second generation Laotian in America, um, and at the same time Native American. So it's interesting to see that combination, because right when we think about diaspora, and we can actually think about diaspora as cultural ties. So it doesn't necessarily just mean that like someone immigrated to a place, or let's say um, whiteness as a culture doesn't have a specific culture, if that makes sense. So like, we have like I have like Laotian culture or Diné culture. Whiteness isn't a culture, and so white people living in the United States essentially in some forms do not live in a diaspora as people of color do, because there's no cultural connections to the place of origin. So I want to make that distinguished. And of course, there are people who are have like live in diaspora from like Scotland, for example. There's a drag queen on RuPaul's Drag Race that I saw who's from Scotland and talks about it. That is living in diaspora, which means like right, you're living in a place that is not originally your homeland, um, but practice and live the traditional teachings of your homeland. And so there you do have a connection in that way, which is I think really powerful and strong, um, and also brings up this conversation that like our connections to land and to people and with each other. What does that look like? Essentially, so I am um, second generation, as I mentioned. My father came here to the United States, I believe Arizona, which I'm born and raised. He came to Arizona during the Vietnam War, which was a time that like he didn't want to have the name Suksavan or identify with any Asian identity, which is very like well known within like that time period and even other time periods too, and even like today. And so he kind of dropped off his name, so he was Tom Kievorbooth, and his original name was Suksavan Kievorbooth, which is my name now. And my family's experience, it's interesting because like my father did come to America, while my mom was like born and raised here, but like as Native people, like this is our homelands, and in some ways if you're not indigenous to the United States, you're either living in a diaspora or you're not. Or, no, or not. Wait, let me rephrase that. You're either living in a diaspora or like you're just living in the space. Because actually, there might be a third one because indigenous people do not live in diaspora because this is our homeland. And so I want to distinguish that because it's important, and important to my experience as someone who lives in Asian diaspora but not in American diaspora because I am Native American in this place. But I do live in some diaspora because I do not live in my traditional homelands of Deneta, which is complicated, which is why we're having this conversation.
Okay, I can go. So I am also first generation. My mom moved here from Peru, and my dad also came to America from Cambodia during the Vietnam War, where he was sponsored to come to America along with his family. So I think definitely having a big family to carry on a lot of like the traditions and culture definitely helps hold a lot of the culture that's passed down to our family. And I think especially being first generation, you feel like you should carry more of the tradition. I see like a lot of my cousins, like the lower it goes, the more I feel like the traditions such as like the food, like, and the ability like to cook it and all that stuff kind of disappears. So that's definitely something interesting that I definitely noticed throughout the generation. But I think that's a very like good topic that like Suksavan definitely brought up about how different parts, especially America, which is like, you know, everyone comes here till it's a melting pot, has its own like, doesn't really count as a diaspora, which is a good point.
I can go next. So every time someone asks me about what's my ethnicity, I always say I'm Vietnamese, Laotian, and I'm Chinese. And I would say I mostly identify as Vietnamese. because we practice Vietnamese culture, eat Vietnamese foods, we speak Vietnamese at home, and so like I consider myself as Vietnamese American, so I'm more in touch with that. As for generation, I am first gen. I didn't realize that it was a big deal until senior year of high school. Something I think it's an interesting question to say about family's experience of living in Asian diaspora. But it made me put me into perspective. When I was growing up, I was mostly with my dad, and at that time, my dad was in America for about 20 or some years. Um, he came here when he was like 19, but he still has, broken English. Didn't graduate high school because it was difficult for him to learn English at like 18, 19. It's a little late for that. Um, but I remember he struggled a lot with like he told me like a lot of fights he would get into regarding back then and how people would make fun of him, stuff like that. But he said that it's just interesting to hear my dad's perspective on how he grew up in America because he developed the mentality of the American mentality where it's like you start from the bottom and then you like gradually go up and you
Mm.
just like that typical American what was I saying? Like
Like the
American dream.
American dream.
There we go. My dad kind of has that along with his low key traditional Asian mindset too. But over the years, I think my dad got pretty Americanized, in a sense, assimilated. And
Mm.
now I like if you were to see him, talk to him, he's like an Asian American, but he just assimilated really well. But however, my stepmom and her grandparents they didn't come into America until like I was like 8 or 9, so they're still used to it. And it's just interesting because they're having a really hard time going from traditional Vietnamese culture to American culture. For example, like okay, so like grades. Um, my brother or something like that would get like a B plus in that. I'm like, that's great. At least you tried. And there's this culture that she goes, no, no, like listen, like back in Vietnam, like it's like he seems lazy because he's not trying hard enough. I was like, I like
Mm.
really thought about it, and I was like, that does not make any sense.
Yeah.
But that's just see, even though she's been here for, I mean, she's been here for probably like a decade now, but it's still she's still getting used to it. Even certain things where I'm like, she's like, oh, well, can you just like go up to a person and make friends? I'm like, well, you can't really just do that now. Like it's a little bit different, it's a little bit dangerous now, especially with everything's going on. It's just a bunch of random stuff that I just realized that it's even them like they're still adapting to it, and like for us, we grew up here, we know the culture, we know the little slang, which neighborhood you do, like food and stuff like that. Um, and for example, and yeah, it's just totally different. The way how we greet people, like in Asian culture, you would kind of bow a little bit and be kind of like timid and respectful and hear the adults. Here, it's kind of like just be you and be kind of speak your word. Um, but yeah, at least thought that was pretty.
So I am technically Chinese American, but I prefer to be identified as Asian American because I am a Chinese adoptee. I don't usually like to use the title Chinese American because I don't feel connected in any way to specific Chinese culture or roots or anything, so that feels like really uncomfortable for me to like claim that identity, I guess, but it is definitely always in the back of my mind, and it is like a part of me, so when people ask, like I do tell them, but I also let them know like I prefer Asian American as a comfort. Within my family, like I guess I'm like the first gen adoptee, but within the family as a whole, like I'm fourth gen. I was adopted into a white family, so they've been here for a while and are doing pretty good, I guess. Um, I guess like for my situation, it's kind of interesting because for the longest time, I didn't consider it diaspora, and I still don't know if I do consider um, my situation of adoption as diaspora. I know there are um, other histories of Asian adoption where it was diaspora and they were forcibly removed and taken. But in my case, closer to the or within the beginning of the 21st century, I don't necessarily consider my situation diaspora, but in a sense, I guess it does, because I am pretty disconnected from, I guess, Chinese culture, and I don't have an understanding of that. And growing up, I didn't really have that implemented in my life through my parents. They weren't really into, like, trying to help reclaim Chinese culture, which is fine. Like, it's a parenting style, and I'm not mad at my parents for that, but I know other families have tried to do that for their adopted children. So I guess in some sense it is a sense of diaspora where you are removed from your homeland, I guess, and then you're removed from your culture and you're not practicing it anymore. But I don't know, it's a very fine line that is very complex and, like, hard for myself to grapple at times. So yeah, other than that, my family hasn't personally been affected by Asian diaspora.
Yeah, I think that leads perfectly into our second question. So, like, especially when Benson was mentioning about his family and how hard it is when first coming to America, the question is, how do you feel about identifying with Western culture but witnessing discrimination, as well as identifying with your homeland but only through passed down relations or nostalgia?
I guess I can go first because I kind of was just talking about this. When I was younger, it didn't bother me as much. Though I guess, like, the thing that bothered me most about being Asian in comparison to white, like my family, was that, like, I felt physically like I was out of place. Like, I always wondered, like, traits and stuff I would get from my parents, and that I didn't fit in, like, with the kids at school. Cultural wise, like, it wasn't anything different. Like, I didn't feel out of place with Western culture, but as I've gotten older, it's one of those things where, like, I found myself in a crossroads of, well, I want to explore my Asian American culture, but I don't fully feel comfortable there. But then at the same time, you're not fully comfortable in Western culture anymore, because you've come to that recollection that your situation is different, and it is not like everybody else's in that sense. But it's, like, for me, it's frustrating too, not only that, because I feel sometimes like I'm obligated to learn only about, like, China and Chinese culture before any, like, other culture, even, like, Native American or African American, like, because I've had that, like, I guess, forcible removal by my parents. I don't know, that sounds awful, but, like, it obviously wasn't my choice. I wasn't born and then moved. And so, to me, in that sense, that's where I found conflict in identifying fully with Western culture, because it is that lingering thought that I'm not, that I could have had a life in China, I guess, and, like, that struggle of what I have to feel obligated to and what identity I have to identify as. I don't know if that, like, fully answers the question, but...
No, yeah, I definitely identify with that a lot, because growing up, for sure, like, I think I'm also very much Americanized, so not being that in touch with, I guess, my Asian side, as well as, like, not having a lot of friends that were Asian, so I didn't really have that much in common with, like, other people or anything to share with them. And then also my family, my parents at least, they're very Americanized. They did come here at a young age, so they're not, I mean, they are in touch with, like, the culture and traditions, but, like, they're very Americanized. Their like, traditions and way of living and mindset is very, like, American. So I think not having a lot of, I guess, culture that I could relate to was definitely something where, like, I'm at the crossroads of, like, I don't really know if I belong more with, like, my Asian side or if I'm more, I guess, like, American. So feeling like I don't really fit in with my Asian friends because I'm not Asian enough, or I don't really fit in with, like, white because I'm not, like, I don't look like them. So definitely I do relate to that.